couldn't believe it. I was finally back home after 8 long years. I missed everything about this place, from the smell of the sea air to the sound of the cicadas chirping in the trees. I couldn't wait to see my old friends again. I especially wanted to see my best friend, John. We had been inseparable since we were kids. I went to his house first thing. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I knocked again, louder this time. Still no answer. I tried the doorknob, and it was unlocked. I opened the door and stepped inside. The house was dark and silent. I called out for John, but there was no answer. I started to get worried. Where was he? I wandered through the house, calling his name. I finally found him in the living room, sitting in his favorite chair. He was smiling at me, but his eyes were empty. "John," I said, "is that you?" He didn't say anything. He just kept smiling. I sat on a sofa and asked him how he was, and about his personal life, and we talked for a long time and then went back to my own house. I told my family about John, and they were just shocked. They told me that John had died 7 years ago. I couldn't believe it. I had just spent the day with a ghost. I didn't know what to do. I was scared and confused. I went to bed that night, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about John. I finally fell asleep, but I had a nightmare. In the nightmare, John was chasing me. He was trying to catch me, and I was running as fast as I could. I woke up screaming. I didn't know what to do. I was afraid to go back to sleep. I was afraid that John would come back to me. I stayed up all night, too scared to close my eyes. The next morning, I went to see a therapist. I told him what had happened, and he helped me to understand that I wasn't crazy. He told me that I had experienced a grief reaction. I was still grieving the loss of John, even though he had been dead for 7 years. The therapist helped me to come to terms with John's death. He also helped me to learn how to cope with my grief. It took some time, but I eventually got better. I was able to sleep again, and I was no longer afraid of John. I still think about him sometimes, but I know that he's in a better place now. I've been a pizza delivery driver for a few years now, and I've seen my fair share of creepy houses. But nothing could have prepared me for the delivery I got last night. It was just past midnight, and I was driving through a dark and deserted neighborhood when I got the call. The address was for a house that I had never seen before, and the caller didn't give me any name or any other information. I pulled up to the house and got out of my car. The place was huge and old, and it looked like it had been abandoned for years. The windows were all boarded up, and the front door was hanging off its hinges. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. No one answered. I knocked again, louder this time. Still no answer. I was starting to get creeped out. I was about to turn around and leave when I heard a voice from inside the house. "Delivery?" the voice said. I hesitated. "Yeah," I said. "Pizza delivery." The door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was tall and thin, with long white hair and a beard. He was wearing a black cloak that billowed behind him. "I ordered a pizza," the man said. I looked at him suspiciously. "Who are you?" I asked. "My name is Mr. Smith," the man said, "and I'm very hungry." I didn't know what to say. I handed the pizza to the man, and he took it without saying a word. He closed the door, and I heard the lock click behind me. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Then I turned and walked back to my car. As I drove away, I could still see the house in my rearview mirror. The lights were on, and I could see the man standing in the doorway watching me. I never went back to that house, and I never saw the man again. But I'll never forget that night, and I'll always wonder what would have happened if I had stayed. I was a regular at the gym, and I always went at the same time late at night. I liked the peace and quiet, and I could always get a good workout in. One night, I was working out on the treadmill when I heard a noise. I turned around, but I didn't see anything. I thought I must have been imagining things, so I went back to my workout. But then I heard the noise again. This time, it was louder. It sounded like someone was crying. I got off the treadmill and went to investigate. I followed the sound to the locker room, and I saw a figure standing in the corner. The figure was tall and thin, and it was wearing a white robe. Its face was hidden in the shadows, but I could see that it was crying. I was scared, but I also felt sorry for the figure. I wanted to help it, so I went over to it. "Are you okay?" I asked. The figure didn't say anything. It just kept crying. I reached out to touch the figure, but my hand went right through it. I realized then that the figure was a ghost. I was so scared that I ran out of the gym. I didn't stop running until I was home. I never went back to that gym again. I didn't want to see the ghost again. But I still think about it sometimes. I wonder who the ghost was and why it was crying. I also wonder if it's still there, waiting for someone to help it. I was walking through the house and it was dark and empty. I could hear footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, there was no one there. I started to run, but the footsteps kept getting closer. I finally ran into a room, and I locked the door behind me. I thought I was safe, but then I heard the doorknob rattle. I knew that whatever was out there was trying to get in. I huddled in the corner of the room, too scared to move. I could hear the thing outside the door, scratching and clawing to get in. I closed my eyes and waited for the inevitable. But then I woke up. I was in my own bed and it was morning. I realized that it had all been a dream, but it had felt so real. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. I had been dreaming about my aunt's house, and it had been terrifying. I got out of bed and went to the window. I looked out at the street. I went downstairs and told my parents about my dream. They just laughed it off and said that it was just a dream. But I knew that it was more than that. Later that day, my parents told me that we were going to visit my aunt. I tried to tell them about my dream again, but they just told me to stop being silly. They said that there was nothing to be afraid of, but I was still scared. I knew that the dream was a warning, and I didn't want to go to my aunt's house. But my parents wouldn't listen. The next day we drove to my aunt's house. As soon as we got there, I felt a sense of dread. The house looked different than it had in my dream, but I knew that something was wrong. We went inside, and my aunt greeted us with a smile. She seemed happy to see us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We stayed at my aunt's house for a few days, and I had a few more nightmares, but I never told anyone about them. I didn't want them to think I was crazy. When it was time to go home, I was relieved. I never wanted to go back to that house again, but I know that I will never forget the dream. It was a warning, and I will never ignore it again. I was driving home from work late one night when a storm hit. The rain was coming down in sheets and the wind was howling. I could barely see the road in front of me. I knew I couldn't keep driving in this weather, so I pulled over to the side of the road. I looked around, but there was no one else around. I saw a house in the distance, and I decided to go there for shelter. I got out of my car and ran to the house. The house was dark and deserted, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of the storm. I went inside and closed the door behind me. I was safe. I looked around the house. It was a mess. There were clothes and furniture everywhere. It looked like no one had lived there in years. I sat down on the couch and tried to relax. I was exhausted and I just wanted to sleep. I closed my eyes and started to drift off. Suddenly, I heard a noise. I opened my eyes and looked around. I didn't see anything. I thought I must have imagined it, so I closed my eyes again. But then I heard the noise again. It was coming from the kitchen. I got up and went to the kitchen. The door was open, and I could see a figure standing in the shadows. "Hello?" I called out. The figure didn't move. I took a step closer. "Is anyone there?" The figure turned around, and I saw that it was a woman. She was wearing a long white dress, and her hair was long and black. She smiled at me, and her eyes were empty. I knew then that she was dead. I screamed and ran out of the house. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car. I got in and drove away, never looking back. I never went back to that house, and I never told anyone what happened. I'm still not sure what it was that I saw that night, but I know that it was something I'll never forget.